The winter of 1634 was unusually cold in Amsterdam. Snow lay thick on the cobblestones, and the canals had frozen solid enough for children to skate between the merchant houses. Inside the warm taverns that lined the Neumarkt, men gathered around wooden tables, their breath visible in the smoky air. They weren't talking about the weather, or the war, or even the latest ships arriving from the East Indies. They were talking about flowers. Not just any flowers, tulips, specifically a particular type of tulip bulb that had begun to appear in the markets. These weren't the simple red or yellow blooms that had graced Dutch gardens for decades. These were different, special. The petals showed streaks of vivid colour, flames of red dancing across white petals, or deep purple veins running through golden blooms like rivers of ink. What the merchants didn't know, what nobody knew at the time, was that these beautiful, sought-after patterns were caused by a virus, a tiny, invisible infection that weakened the bulb even as it created those mesmerizing designs. But in those smoky taverns, surrounded by the smell of ale and pipe tobacco, such scientific explanations seemed impossibly distant. All they knew was that people wanted these bulbs, desperately. To understand how flowers could drive an entire nation to madness, we need to step back into that world. The Dutch Republic in the 1630s was a place of unprecedented prosperity. Ships arrived daily at Amsterdam's harbour, their holds heavy with spices from Java, silver from the New World, silk from China. The middle class was growing, people had money, and they were looking for ways to make more. Tulips had arrived in Holland from the Ottoman Empire decades earlier, carried by traders who recognized their beauty. But growing them was a slow, patient art. A single bulb took 7 years to mature from seed. Even then, you never knew what colors would emerge when the flower finally bloomed. The infected bulbs, the ones that created those stunning patterns, were called bizarres, and they were impossibly rare. When one appeared in a garden, word would spread through the neighborhood like whispers of buried treasure. Soon, people would arrive at the grower's door, coins in hand, desperate to buy not just the flower, but the promise of what lay sleeping in the dark earth beneath it. In those early days, the prices seemed reasonable enough. A skilled craftsman might pay a month's wages for a particularly fine bulb. Wealthy merchants thought nothing of spending what they'd normally pay for a horse. After all, these weren't just flowers, they were investments. Living, growing investments that would multiply underground, creating more bulbs, more beauty, more profit. And so the market grew. By 1636, something strange was happening in the taverns and marketplaces of Holland. The tulip trade was no longer about flowers. It had become something else entirely, something that would have been familiar to any modern stock trader. Men who had never touched a garden tool were buying and selling bulbs they'd never seen, for gardens they didn't own. The bulbs themselves often stayed buried in the ground, changing hands on paper while they slept through the winter months. Contracts were written and traded. Promises to deliver specific bulbs at specific times for specific prices. The prices began to climb. What had cost a month's wages now cost 3 months, then 6. The most prized bulbs, the ones with the most dramatic colour breaks, were selling for sums that would have bought entire houses just a year before. And still, people bought them. In the harbour town of Alkmaar, a sailor traded his house for 3 rare bulbs. In Haarlem, a brewery owner pawned his equipment to buy a single Semper Augustus, a white tulip with brilliant red flames that had become legendary among collectors. Stories spread of fortunes made overnight, of common labourers who'd become wealthy by trading nothing more than promises written on scraps of paper. The fever was spreading. January of 1637 arrived with brutal cold. The canals froze thicker than anyone could remember, and the tulip bulbs lay deep beneath the snow, dormant and dreaming. But above ground, the market had become a frenzy. In a single tavern in the small town of Alkmaar, on one extraordinary day that winter, a single bulb of the coveted Viceroy variety changed hands for the equivalent of 20 times what it had cost just months before. 20 times. In a matter of hours, men were shouting bids across smoky rooms, their voices hoarse with excitement and greed. But there was something desperate in their voices now, something that hadn't been there before. The laughter was a little too loud, the confidence a little too forced. Perhaps some of them were beginning to sense what was coming, though none would admit it, even to themselves. The crash, when it came, was swift and merciless. It began in early February, in the same taverns where the mania had flourished. Someone, history doesn't record who, tried to sell a batch of bulbs and found no buyers. The price he was asking, which would have seemed reasonable just days before, suddenly seemed absurd. Word spread quickly through the tight network of traders. If no one would buy at yesterday's prices, what were the bulbs really worth? The question hung in the cold air like smoke from a snuffed candle. And then, as if someone had opened a floodgate, the selling began. Prices that had taken months to climb collapsed in days. Bulbs that had traded for the price of houses were suddenly worth no more than onions. The men who had mortgaged their homes, sold their businesses, borrowed against their futures. They watched their paper fortunes evaporate like morning mist. The promises they'd made, the contracts they'd signed, suddenly seemed like cruel jokes written in a language they no longer understood. By March, the mania was over. The bulbs lay in the frozen ground, unchanged. They would bloom that spring, as beautiful as ever, their virus-streaked petals dancing in the Dutch sunlight. But the dreams that had been planted alongside them, those had withered and died. As spring arrived and the first tulips began to push through the thawing soil, life in Holland slowly returned to normal. The flowers bloomed, magnificent and fleeting, and then faded, as flowers always do. The bulbs that had commanded fortunes were quietly planted in gardens where they belonged, tended by people who loved them for their beauty rather than their price. But the story of the tulip mania was just beginning. Within decades, similar patterns would emerge in other places, other markets, other dreams of easy wealth. The details would change, but the human heart, the human capacity for hope and greed and crowd-following madness, that would remain constant. And indeed, by the early 1700s, new opportunities were stirring. Across the English Channel, in the coffee houses of London, men were gathering to discuss not flowers, but companies, joint stock companies with grand names and grander promises. The year 1711 brought with it the scent of possibility. In the panelled rooms of Westminster, Parliament was debating the creation of something unprecedented, a company that would solve Britain's growing debt crisis while making its investors spectacularly wealthy. The War of the Spanish Succession had been expensive, brutally expensive. The British government owed £32 million to creditors, a sum so vast it seemed impossible to repay. Interest payments alone were crippling the treasury. Something had to be done. And so the South Sea Company was born. On paper, it was elegant in its simplicity. The company would take over the government's debt in exchange for exclusive trading rights to the Spanish colonies in South America. The Spanish Empire was vast and wealthy. Surely there were fortunes to be made in trade with these distant lands. The company would make money from trade, pay the government's creditors, and everyone would profit. It sounded perfectly reasonable, logical even, and perhaps, in a different world, it might have worked. But this was the world of 1711, a world where dreams had a way of growing faster than reality could sustain them. The South Sea Company's promises were built on a foundation of sand, though few recognized it at the time. The Treaty of Utrecht, signed in 1713, was supposed to open the lucrative Spanish colonial markets to British trade. But when the details were finally negotiated, the reality proved far less generous than the dreams. Spain granted the company permission to send exactly one ship per year to trade with their colonies. One ship, for an entire empire that stretched from Mexico to Argentina. And even that single ship would be heavily taxed, its cargo inspected, its profits shared with the Spanish crown. There was also the asiento, the contract to supply slaves to the Spanish colonies. It sounded lucrative to men sitting in London coffee houses, but the reality was grim and complex. The costs of maintaining slave forts along the African coast, the losses during the brutal Middle Passage, the competition from other traders. It all ate into profits that existed more on paper than in practice. But in the early years of the company's existence, such inconvenient truths were easily overlooked. The men who bought shares weren't investing in the harsh realities of colonial trade. They were investing in stories, in possibilities, in the intoxicating dream of Spanish gold flowing into British pockets. And then, in 1718, something extraordinary happened. King George I agreed to become the company's governor. The king himself, the very pinnacle of British society, lending his name and reputation to the venture. If the South Sea Company was good enough for royalty, surely it was good enough for anyone. While the South Sea Company was taking shape in London, across the English Channel in Paris, another dreamer was spinning his own web of financial magic. John Law was a fascinating character, a Scottish exile with a gambler's soul and a financier's mind. Law had fled Britain years earlier, after killing a man in a duel over a woman's affections. He'd spent his exile studying the financial systems of Europe, watching how money flowed between nations, how credit worked, how confidence could create wealth almost from thin air. France in 1716 was in desperate straits. The long wars of Louis XIV had drained the treasury. The government was spending twice what it collected in taxes. Something radical was needed, and John Law believed he had the answer. He convinced the French authorities to let him establish the Banque Générale, a bank that would issue paper notes backed by government promise rather than gold or silver. It was revolutionary. Most Europeans still distrusted paper money, preferring the solid weight of coins in their purses. But Law's notes were accepted throughout France, and slowly, people began to believe. If paper could represent gold, if promises could become currency, then perhaps there were no limits to what financial innovation could achieve. In 1717, Law took control of the Compagnie du Mississippi. Like the South Sea Company, it was built on dreams of colonial wealth. But where the South Sea Company was focused on Spanish America, Law's company held the monopoly on trade with French Louisiana, a vast territory that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. Law painted pictures of cities rising from the wilderness, of gold mines and tobacco plantations, of rivers flowing with profit. The company's shares, he promised, would make their owners rich beyond imagination. And people believed him. The year 1720 began with Paris in the grip of unprecedented financial fever. Law's Mississippi Company shares, which had started at 500 livres, climbed steadily through the autumn of 1719. By January of 1720, they had reached 18,000 livres. 18,000, a 36-fold increase in less than 3 years. The streets around Law's bank were clogged with carriages. Nobles who had never soiled their hands with commerce stood in line next to merchants and shopkeepers, all desperate to buy shares. Servants were sent with bags of gold to purchase stock for their masters. Stories spread of coachmen who'd bought a few shares and become wealthy enough to buy their own coaches. The entire French national debt had been converted into Mississippi Company shares. The government's financial problems were solved, at least on paper. John Law was hailed as a genius, a magician who had transformed lead into gold through the alchemy of credit and confidence. But across the Channel in London, observers were taking note. If the French could create such wealth from colonial promises, surely the British could do the same, and do it better. The South Sea Company had been drifting along quietly for nearly a decade, paying modest dividends from its limited trade. But in 1720, its directors began to dream bigger dreams, much bigger. The proposal that emerged from the South Sea Company's boardroom was breathtaking in its audacity. The company offered to take over the entire British national debt, £32 million, in exchange for stock. Creditors would trade their government bonds for South Sea shares. The company would pay the government £7.5 million for the privilege. It seemed like magic. The government would receive immediate cash. Creditors would own shares in a company with exclusive rights to Spanish colonial trade. The company would profit from trade and from managing the debt. Everyone would win. The company sweetened the deal with promises of ever-increasing dividends. 6% initially, then 8%, then 10%. Some whispered that returns of 100% weren't impossible. After all, look what the French had achieved with their Mississippi Company. Parliament debated the proposal through the spring of 1720. There was opposition. Some members worried about the precedent of a private company taking over government debt. But the company's directors were persuasive. They had friends in high places. They had the king as their governor. And they had something else. They had perfect timing. News from Paris was intoxicating. Law's Mississippi shares continued their impossible climb. French nobles were becoming millionaires overnight. If France could create such wealth from its American colonies, surely Britain, with its superior navy, its established trade networks, its Protestant work ethic, surely Britain could do even better. The bill passed, the deal was approved, and the South Sea Company prepared to work its own brand of financial magic. The summer of 1720 was unusually warm in London. The coffee houses of Exchange Alley sweltered in the heat, but inside, the conversations burned even hotter. South Sea Company stock had begun its remarkable ascent. The company had launched a masterful campaign to drive up share prices. They offered increasingly generous terms to buyers. Subscribers could pay in installments. They could use the shares themselves as collateral for loans to buy more shares. The company would lend money to buyers at low interest rates, secured by the very stock they were purchasing. It was a feedback loop of rising prices and rising confidence. As the stock climbed, more people wanted to buy. As more people bought, the stock climbed higher. The directors themselves were actively trading, buying and selling to create the impression of constant demand. They made sure that each subscription, each new offering of shares, was oversubscribed, with buyers clamoring for more stock than was available. Word spread through London's drawing rooms and taverns. Fortunes were being made daily. A merchant who bought shares on Monday could sell them on Friday for twice what he'd paid. Servants, overhearing their masters' conversations, rushed to invest their life savings. Even the skeptical found themselves swept along by the tide of easy money. Among those caught up in the frenzy was one of Europe's greatest minds. Sir Isaac Newton had revolutionized physics, mathematics, and astronomy. His Principia had unveiled the mathematical laws that govern the motion of planets. He could calculate the precise orbit of celestial bodies decades into the future. But he could not calculate the madness of crowds. Newton had bought South Sea stock early and sold it for a tidy profit of £7,000. It was a substantial sum, enough to live comfortably for years. The rational thing to do would have been to step back and watch the continuing frenzy from a safe distance. But Newton was only human, as he watched the stock continue its impossible climb, as he saw his friends and colleagues becoming wealthy beyond his £7,000 profit. The temptation became too great. He bought back in at much higher prices. By August of 1720, South Sea stock had reached £1,000 per share. The company that had started the year trading at around £100 had multiplied tenfold in just 8 months. London had never seen anything like it. The narrow streets around the Royal Exchange were clogged with carriages as investors rushed to trade. New coffee houses opened just to handle the overflow of speculators. Clerks worked by candlelight, struggling to keep up with the paperwork of constantly changing ownership. The wealth being created was staggering, at least on paper. Men who had started the year as modest tradesmen were now worth more than landed nobles. The company's directors, who held substantial positions, were among the richest men in Britain. But the most remarkable thing about this wealth was how little it had to do with the company's actual business. The South Sea Company's trade with Spanish America remained minimal. That single ship per year, laden with British goods and returning with Spanish silver, could never justify stock prices that valued the company at more than the entire British economy. Yet somehow this didn't seem to matter. The stock market had developed its own logic, its own momentum. Prices rose because people believed they would rise. People believed they would rise because they were rising. It was a perfect circle of confidence and greed. And like all perfect circles, it was also perfectly fragile. The first cracks appeared not in London, but in Paris. John Law's Mississippi bubble had reached impossible heights by the spring of 1720. The company's stock had made paper millionaires of thousands of Frenchmen. But the gap between the paper value and the actual profits from Louisiana trade had become impossible to ignore. In July of 1720, the Mississippi Company announced its dividend payments. The amount was disappointing, far less than what the stock price seemed to justify. For the first time, some investors began to wonder if they were paying too much for too little. The selling began slowly. A few cautious souls decided to take profits. But in a market built on confidence, doubt spreads faster than fire. As prices began to fall, more investors decided to sell. As more sold, prices fell faster. John Law tried desperately to shore up confidence. His bank printed more notes, trying to provide enough currency to meet demand from panicking investors. But this only made things worse. The more notes the bank printed, the less each note was worth. People began demanding gold and silver instead of paper. By autumn, Law's entire system was collapsing. The bank suspended payments. The Mississippi Company's stock became worthless. The paper millionaires found themselves holding nothing but pretty printed certificates. John Law, once the most powerful financier in Europe, fled Paris in the dead of night. He would spend his remaining years gambling in Venice, living off the charity of former associates. His tombstone in the church of St. Moise still bears witness to his rise and fall. News of the Mississippi collapse reached London in early September. At first, many British investors thought this was good news. With the French bubble burst, surely more investment would flow to London. The South Sea Company would benefit from its rival's misfortune. But doubt, once it takes root, grows quickly. September of 1720 was the month when London learned that what goes up can come down just as fast. The collapse began with whispers in the coffee houses. A few well-connected investors began quietly selling their shares. They'd heard rumors, stories of company directors selling their own stock, hints that the promised trade with Spanish America was never going to justify the astronomical stock prices. At first, the selling was orderly, genteel even. But as prices began to drop, orderliness gave way to panic. The same feedback loop that had driven prices up now drove them down. As stock prices fell, people rushed to sell before they fell further. As more people sold, prices fell faster. The loans that the company had made to investors, secured by the stock itself, became worthless as collateral. By December, South Sea stock had crashed to £124 per share, from a peak of £1,000 in August to barely more than its starting price by Christmas. 80% of the peak value gone. The human cost was devastating. Men who had mortgaged their estates to buy stock found themselves bankrupt. Widows who had invested their life savings were reduced to poverty. The streets of London filled with angry crowds demanding explanations, demanding justice, demanding someone to blame. Isaac Newton surveyed his losses with the weary wisdom of a man who had spent his life studying universal laws. His total losses were equivalent to what would be £40 million today. "I can calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies," he said, "but not the madness of people." It was a confession that would echo through the centuries, a reminder that even the greatest minds are no match for the collective madness of crowds. The aftermath of the South Sea bubble was swift and harsh. Parliament demanded investigations. The company's directors were examined, their personal finances scrutinized, their methods exposed. Some were imprisoned, others fled the country. But the most significant response came in the form of new legislation. The Bubble Act of 1720 banned the creation of joint stock companies without explicit parliamentary approval. It was a direct reaction to the speculation that had driven both the South Sea Company and dozens of smaller ventures to impossible heights. The Act would remain in force for over a century, fundamentally shaping how British business was conducted. No more would promoters be able to create companies with grand names and grander promises without government oversight. The age of easy speculation, at least in Britain, was over. The man who managed much of the crisis response was Robert Walpole, who served as Chancellor of the Exchequer during the bubble's aftermath. His steady hand during the crisis helped establish his reputation as a safe pair of hands. Within a year, he would become Britain's first Prime Minister, a position he would hold for 2 decades. The South Sea bubble had ended careers and fortunes, but it had also launched others. Meanwhile, in France, the collapse of John Law's system had deeper and more lasting consequences. The French had lost faith not just in the Mississippi Company, but in the entire concept of paper money and banking. This distrust would persist for generations, leaving France without a proper central bank until well into the 19th century. The contrast with Britain was striking. Despite the painful collapse of the South Sea bubble, Britain's underlying economy remained strong. The country had established institutions: the Bank of England, a developed bond market, a tradition of commercial law. That provided stability even during times of crisis. Within a few years, London's financial markets had recovered. New companies were formed, though under much stricter regulations. Trade continued. The stock exchange evolved and grew stronger. But the scars remained. The phrase "bubble" itself entered the language through the Bubble Act, becoming the standard term for speculative manias. The memory of 1720 would be invoked whenever stock prices seemed to rise too high, too fast. And the patterns, the human patterns, those remained unchanged. As we look back across the centuries from our comfortable distance, certain themes emerge with startling clarity. The Tulip Mania of 1637, Law's Mississippi Scheme, the South Sea Bubble. They seem like ancient history, quaint examples of human folly from a more naive age. But the patterns they established, those patterns would repeat again and again. There would always be new technologies, new territories, new promises of easy wealth. The details would change, but the human emotions, the hope, the greed, the fear of missing out, the willingness to believe that this time was different, those would remain constant. In the centuries that followed, similar scenes would play out around railway shares, around radio companies, around internet stocks, around cryptocurrency. The venues would shift from Amsterdam taverns to London coffee houses to New York trading floors to computer screens around the world. But always, there would be the same fundamental story. Prices rising for reasons that seemed logical at the time. Crowds following crowds, fortunes made and lost. And eventually, the inevitable reckoning when reality reasserted itself. What made these early bubbles so significant was not just their size or their impact, but their role as templates. They established the vocabulary of speculation. They showed how confidence could create value from nothing, and how quickly that confidence could evaporate. They also demonstrated something deeper about human nature. Even Isaac Newton, one of the greatest intellects in human history, could not resist the pull of the crowd. If someone who could calculate the orbit of planets could be swept up in speculative madness, what hope did ordinary investors have? Perhaps that was the most important lesson of all, that intelligence and rationality, however powerful, are no match for the collective emotions of markets. That understanding the mathematics of planetary motion is one thing, but understanding the mathematics of human behavior is something else entirely. The men who bought those virus-streaked tulip bulbs in Dutch taverns, they weren't fools. They were responding rationally to the information they had, the social pressures they faced, the opportunities they perceived. The investors who poured their life savings into Mississippi Company shares, they weren't stupid. They were following a system that had made others wealthy, backed by a bank that issued currency accepted throughout France. The subscribers to South Sea stock, they weren't naive. They were investing in a company blessed by the King of England, granted monopoly rights to trade with the Spanish Empire, managed by men of reputation and standing. Each decision, taken individually, made sense. It was only in aggregate over time that the madness became apparent. And perhaps that's the most sobering lesson of all, that financial bubbles aren't the result of mass stupidity or collective irrationality. They're the result of rational people making rational decisions based on incomplete information in an irrational world. The tulip growers of Holland. the coffee house speculators of London, the paper millionaires of Paris. They were all responding to the same fundamental human impulses that drive markets today: the fear of missing out, the desire for security and wealth, the willingness to believe in a better tomorrow. Those impulses haven't changed. The technologies have evolved. The markets have grown more sophisticated. The regulations have become more complex. But underneath it all, the same human heart beats with the same hopes and fears and dreams. And so the cycles continue. As night falls over the markets of the world, as trading floors empty and computer screens go dark, the ghosts of those early speculators might find something familiar in the silence. The same hopes that drove Dutch merchants to mortgage their homes for tulip bulbs still drive investors today. The same confidence that convinced French nobles to convert their estates into Mississippi shares still moves markets around the world. The same human capacity for both brilliance and folly that led Isaac Newton to lose a fortune on South Sea stock, that capacity remains unchanged. The venues have shifted from taverns to exchanges to electronic networks spanning the globe. The assets have evolved from flower bulbs to colonial trading companies to technologies we're only beginning to understand. But the fundamental story remains the same. It's a story about human nature, about the eternal tension between fear and greed, between wisdom and folly, between individual rationality and collective madness. It's a story that began in those Amsterdam taverns 4 centuries ago, and continues today in trading rooms and bedroom offices and mobile phone screens around the world. The names change, the technologies evolve, the fortunes rise and fall. But the story, the eternal human story of hope and dreams and the endless search for something better, that story never ends. It simply waits for the next chapter to begin. And in that waiting, in that quiet pause between one bubble and the next, there's a kind of peace. The markets sleep, the dreams rest. The world turns slowly through the darkness, carrying its cargo of human hopes toward whatever dawn awaits. The tulips, after all, still bloom each spring in Dutch gardens, simple and beautiful and temporary, just as they were meant to be. And perhaps that's enough. But even as those tulips bloomed and faded with the passing seasons, the seeds of future speculation were already being planted in the fertile soil of human ambition. The early bubbles had established something more lasting than the fortunes they created and destroyed. They had created a template, a pattern that would echo through the centuries. In the decades that followed the great crashes of 1720, Europe slowly rebuilt its financial confidence. The scars remained visible: France's deep distrust of banking, Britain's restrictive Bubble Act, the cautious whispers in coffee houses whenever stock prices began to rise too quickly. But memory, like morning mist, has a way of fading with time. New generations of investors emerged, men who had heard the stories of Tulip Mania and the South Sea bubble as distant tales from their fathers' youth. To them, these seemed like ancient history, cautionary tales from a more primitive age when people didn't understand markets the way they did now. And gradually, confidence returned. Not the wild, intoxicating confidence of 1637 or 1720, but a steadier kind of faith in the possibility of progress, of profit, of turning today's savings into tomorrow's security. The Industrial Revolution brought new kinds of dreams. Steam engines and spinning jennies promised to transform the world in ways that even colonial trade had not. Factories rose like cathedrals along England's rivers, their smokestacks reaching toward the sky like prayers made of iron and coal. And with these new machines came new investment opportunities. Joint stock companies, carefully regulated under the Bubble Act, began to emerge once again. But these were different from the speculative ventures of the early 1700s. These companies built real things: canals and turnpike roads, mills and manufactories. The profits were real too, though they came slowly, through years of patient operation rather than overnight speculation. Investors learned to think in terms of dividends rather than capital gains, of steady returns rather than spectacular windfalls. For a while, it seemed that the lessons of the past had been truly learned, that the age of bubbles was over, replaced by a more mature understanding of how markets really worked. But beneath the surface, the same human impulses that had driven men to trade their homes for tulip bulbs were merely sleeping, waiting for the right moment to reawaken. That moment came with the railways. Nothing in human history had ever moved faster than a horse. For thousands of years, the speed of travel had been limited by the strength of animals and the endurance of men. A journey that took days would always take days. Distance was measured not in miles but in time that could not be compressed or abbreviated. And then, in 1825, the Stockton and Darlington Railway opened in northern England. A steam locomotive called Locomotion pulled a train of coal wagons at the breathtaking speed of 15 miles per hour. Crowds gathered along the tracks to witness this miracle. A machine that moved faster than any living thing, powered by nothing more than boiling water and the ancient compressed forests that lay buried in the earth. Within a decade, passenger railways were carrying people between cities at speeds that would have been unimaginable to their grandparents. A journey from London to Birmingham that had taken 2 days by coach could now be completed in a few hours of comfort and safety. The implications were staggering. If goods and people could move this quickly, cheaply, and reliably, then entire industries would be transformed. Farmers could ship their produce to distant cities before it spoiled. Manufacturers could reach markets hundreds of miles away. The very geography of commerce was being redrawn. And where there was transformation, there was opportunity for profit. The railway mania of the 1840s began quietly enough. A few successful lines had proven that railways could be profitable. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway, opened in 1830, paid handsome dividends to its shareholders. The Great Western Railway, engineered by the brilliant Isambard Kingdom Brunel, connected London to Bristol and opened up the west of England to rapid development. These early successes attracted investors who had watched cautiously from the sidelines. Railway shares offered something that government bonds could not: the possibility of participating in the transformation of the world. But as more railways were built, something familiar began to happen. The success of existing lines convinced people that any railway, properly planned and executed, would surely be profitable. After all, if a line between 2 major cities could succeed, why not a line between any 2 points on the map? Promoters began to appear with schemes for railways that would connect every village to every other village. Lines were proposed that would run through sparsely populated countryside, serving markets that barely existed. Some schemes called for multiple competing lines along the same routes, as if the country could support infinite transportation capacity. Parliament, overwhelmed by applications, approved hundreds of new railway companies. In 1845 and 1846 alone, they authorized the construction of over 4,000 miles of new track, more than existed in the entire rest of the world combined. The speculation had begun again. The patterns were achingly familiar to anyone who remembered the stories of tulips and South Sea stock. Ordinary people mortgaged their homes to buy railway shares. Clerks spent their life savings on companies that existed only on paper. Servants overheard their masters discussing railway investments and rushed to put their modest wages into the latest scheme. The shares were sold in installments, just as South Sea stock had been. Investors could buy a stake in a railway company by paying only a small portion of the full price up front, with the remainder due as construction progressed. This made the shares accessible to people of modest means. And it also meant that investors were committed to much larger investments than they initially realized. As construction costs mounted and additional payments came due, many found themselves trapped. They could not afford to make the additional payments, but they could not afford to lose what they had already invested. Some sold everything they owned to meet their obligations. Others simply walked away, forfeiting their initial investments. The human cost was enormous. Families were ruined. Life savings disappeared. The very people who had hoped to benefit from the railway revolution found themselves crushed beneath its wheels. And yet, unlike the Tulip Mania or the South Sea bubble, something lasting emerged from the railway mania. When the speculation ended and the worthless companies collapsed, thousands of miles of railway track remained. The infrastructure built during those frenzied years would serve Britain for more than a century. The speculation had been madness, but the railways themselves were real. They transformed the British economy, connected remote regions to major markets, and laid the foundation for further industrial development. It was a pattern that would repeat many times in the centuries that followed. Speculative bubbles would inflate around genuinely transformative technologies. The speculation would be excessive, the human cost would be real, but something valuable would often survive the collapse. As the 19th century progressed, the speed of change accelerated. Telegraph wires began to span continents, carrying messages faster than any ship or train. The Suez Canal opened a shorter route to India and the Far East. The Transcontinental Railroad connected America's Atlantic and Pacific coasts. Each new technology, each new connection, seemed to shrink the world a little further. Distances that had once seemed insurmountable became routine journeys. Markets that had once been separate began to merge into a single, interconnected system. And with each connection, each innovation, came new opportunities for both genuine progress and speculative excess. The late 1800s saw bubbles form around everything from bicycle manufacturing to electric lighting companies. The pattern was always the same. Initial success by pioneers would attract imitators, imitators would attract investors, and investors would drive prices to unsustainable levels before reality reasserted itself. But each collapse taught new lessons, created new regulations, and slowly built the institutional knowledge that would make markets more stable, at least until the next wave of innovation created new opportunities for old mistakes. The 20th century arrived with unprecedented fanfare. The world felt poised on the brink of limitless progress. Electricity was illuminating cities that had been dark since the dawn of time. Automobiles were beginning to replace horses on city streets. The Wright brothers had achieved powered flight, opening the sky to human ambition. Everything seemed possible, and in that atmosphere of boundless optimism, the stage was set for the greatest speculative bubble the world had yet seen. The 1920s in America were a time of extraordinary confidence. The Great War was over, won decisively by the forces of democracy. The economy was booming. New technologies were transforming daily life at a pace that previous generations could never have imagined. Radio brought entertainment and news directly into people's homes. Automobiles were no longer luxury items for the wealthy, but practical necessities for the middle class. Motion pictures created entirely new forms of artistic expression and popular culture. Corporate profits soared as companies found ways to mass-produce goods that had once been handcrafted luxuries. The assembly line techniques pioneered by Henry Ford revolutionized manufacturing, making everything from cars to household appliances cheaper and more widely available. And as corporate profits rose, so did the stock market. What began as rational investor enthusiasm for genuinely profitable companies gradually evolved into something more familiar. Stock prices began to rise not because earnings were increasing, but because prices were rising. People bought stocks not because they understood the companies they were investing in, but because everyone else seemed to be making money. The mechanisms of speculation had evolved since the days of tulips and South Sea stock, but the underlying psychology remained unchanged. By the late 1920s, American stock markets had developed their own unique culture of optimism. Stockbrokers became celebrities, their opinions quoted in newspapers and repeated in barbershops. Investment clubs formed in cities across the country, with ordinary citizens pooling their resources to buy shares in companies they knew only by name. Banks began offering loans specifically for stock purchases, allowing investors to buy shares with borrowed money. The practice, known as buying on margin, meant that small investors could control much larger positions than their savings alone would permit. It also meant that small price movements could have enormous consequences. An investor who borrowed 90% of a stock's purchase price would double their money if the stock rose just 10%. But they would also be wiped out if it fell by the same amount. The mathematics of leverage are unforgiving, but in the euphoric atmosphere of the late 20s, such concerns seemed pessimistic. Stocks had been rising for years. Everyone knew someone who had made a fortune in the market. Why worry about downside risks when the only direction stocks seemed to move was up? Professional economists and financial analysts began to argue that perhaps the old rules no longer applied. Maybe this time really was different. Maybe the combination of new technologies, professional management, and sophisticated financial instruments had created a new kind of economy, one where stock prices could rise indefinitely without the painful corrections that had characterized previous eras. It was a seductive theory, and like all seductive theories, it attracted believers precisely because people wanted so desperately to believe it. The peak came in the autumn of 1929. Stock prices had reached levels that seemed to defy any rational relationship to corporate earnings or economic fundamentals. But somehow, the market continued climbing. On paper, the wealth being created was staggering. Ordinary clerks who had bought a few shares years earlier found themselves worth more than their annual salaries. Middle-class families discovered that their modest stock investments had grown large enough to pay for their children's college educations or their own comfortable retirements. The illusion of wealth was so complete, so convincing, that many people began to make life decisions based on their paper profits. They bought larger homes, confident that their stock gains would cover the mortgage payments. They quit their jobs to become full-time investors. They borrowed against their stock portfolios to fund lavish lifestyles. And then, on a crisp October morning, the selling began. October 24th, 1929, Black Thursday, the day that would forever after serve as a reminder that what goes up must eventually come down. The collapse was swift and merciless. Stock prices that had taken years to build fell by double-digit percentages in a matter of hours. The ticker tape machines that reported stock prices couldn't keep up with the volume of trading. Brokers worked by flickering gaslight as the trading day stretched deep into the night. But the real pain came in the days and weeks that followed. October 29th, Black Tuesday, saw even steeper losses. Within a month, the stock market had lost nearly half its value. Within 3 years, it would lose 90%. The human cost was incalculable. Investors who had been millionaires on paper found themselves bankrupt in reality. Families lost their life savings, their homes, their hope for the future. Banks that had lent money for stock purchases found themselves holding worthless collateral. The stock market crash didn't cause the Great Depression that followed, but it certainly contributed to its severity. The destruction of wealth, both real and imagined, created a crisis of confidence that spread far beyond Wall Street. Once again, the ancient patterns had reasserted themselves. Hope had given way to greed, greed to panic, and panic to despair. The Great Depression that followed the 1929 crash lasted for more than a decade. It reshaped not just American society, but the entire global economy. New regulations were put in place to prevent the kind of speculative excess that had led to the crash. The Securities and Exchange Commission was created to oversee financial markets. Banking was separated from securities trading. For a generation, these reforms seemed to work. The stock market remained relatively stable through the middle decades of the 20th century. Investors were more cautious, regulators more vigilant, and speculation more constrained. But once again, memory proved to be ephemeral. As the decades passed, new generations of investors emerged who knew the Great Depression only as a chapter in history books. The reforms put in place after 1929 began to seem outdated, obstacles to the free flow of capital that the modern economy required. Gradually, the regulations were relaxed. Banks were allowed back into the securities business. New financial instruments were created that existed in regulatory grey areas. The lessons of the past, so clear to those who had lived through the crashes, began to fade in the memory of those who had not. And inevitably, speculation returned. The late 20th century saw a series of bubbles, each following the familiar pattern, but with new twists appropriate to the age. The 1980s brought a speculative mania around corporate takeovers and junk bonds. The 1990s saw the rise and spectacular fall of the dot-com bubble, as investors poured billions into internet companies that had never made a profit. Each bubble seemed to promise that this time was different. The internet really was transforming commerce and communication. Surely the old rules about profits and revenues didn't apply to companies that were pioneering entirely new ways of doing business. The patterns were so familiar they were almost comical, if they hadn't been so tragic for the people caught up in them. Once again, ordinary investors mortgaged their homes to buy stocks. Once again, paper millionaires emerged overnight. Once again, the inevitable crash wiped out fortunes and shattered dreams. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about these modern bubbles was how quickly they were forgotten. The dot-com crash of 2000 was followed within just a few years by a housing bubble that dwarfed anything in previous history. The housing crash of 2008 was followed by speculative manias around everything from cryptocurrency to special-purpose acquisition companies. The speed of forgetting seemed to accelerate with each cycle. What had once taken generations now took mere years. The institutional memory that had once provided some protection against speculative excess was being eroded by the rapid pace of change and the constant pressure to find new sources of profit. And yet, through all these cycles of boom and bust, certain truths have remained constant. The human impulses that drove Dutch merchants to trade their homes for tulip bulbs are the same impulses that drive modern investors to pour their savings into the latest technological marvel or financial innovation. The fear of missing out, the envy of others' apparent success, the hope that this investment will finally provide the security and prosperity that have always seemed just out of reach. These emotions transcend any particular time or place or technology. They are, in a very real sense, part of what makes us human. The capacity for hope, after all, is what allows societies to progress. The willingness to believe in a better future is what motivates people to work, to save, to invest, to build. Without that optimism, that faith in the possibility of improvement, human civilization would stagnate. But optimism, like any powerful force, can be dangerous when it loses contact with reality. Hope can become greed, faith can become delusion, and the very human qualities that drive progress can also drive destruction. The challenge, the eternal human challenge, is finding the balance between healthy optimism and destructive speculation, between the hope that motivates genuine progress and the greed that creates artificial bubbles. As we look back across the centuries, from those Amsterdam taverns where men traded land deeds for tulip bulbs to the electronic trading networks where fortunes are made and lost in milliseconds, certain patterns emerge with startling clarity. Every generation believes it has learned the lessons of the past. Every generation develops new safeguards, new regulations, new ways of thinking about risk and reward. And every generation discovers that human nature is more powerful than human institutions. The technologies change, the regulations evolve, the markets become more sophisticated, more global, more interconnected. But the fundamental story remains the same. It's a story about people trying to build better lives for themselves and their families, about the tension between security and opportunity, between prudence and ambition, about the eternal human struggle to distinguish between genuine value and mere speculation. And perhaps most importantly, it's a story about the power of crowds, the way individual rationality can give way to collective madness, the way reasonable people can make unreasonable decisions when they're caught up in the momentum of mass enthusiasm. Isaac Newton's confession, "I can calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people," remains as relevant today as it was 3 centuries ago. Perhaps more relevant, given the speed and scale of modern markets. But there's something else in these stories. Something beyond the familiar cycles of greed and fear. There's also genuine human progress. The Tulip Mania was indeed madness, but it was madness around something genuinely beautiful. Those virus-streaked flowers, for all the pain they caused when treated as investments, brought real joy to the gardens where they finally bloomed. The railway mania bankrupted thousands of investors, but it also created the transportation infrastructure that powered British industrial development for more than a century. The speculation was excessive, but the underlying technology was transformative. Even the dot-com bubble, for all its absurdities and tragedies, helped fund the development of internet technologies that have revolutionized human communication and commerce. Many of the companies that went bankrupt during the crash were working on ideas that would eventually succeed, just under different management and different business models. In this sense, speculative bubbles might be understood as a kind of evolutionary process. Most of the companies and investments caught up in the mania fail and disappear, but a few survive, adapt, and become the foundation for genuine progress. The waste is enormous. The human cost is real. But something valuable often emerges from the wreckage. It's not a justification for speculation exactly, but it does suggest that these manias might serve some larger purpose in the ecology of human progress, even if that purpose is invisible to the people caught up in them at the time. The modern world moves at a pace that would have been incomprehensible to those Dutch tulip traders or British South Sea investors. Information travels at the speed of light. Fortunes can be made or lost in microseconds. The global markets never sleep, passing from continent to continent as the Earth turns. But for all this technological sophistication, the fundamental human drama remains unchanged. Somewhere right now, in trading rooms and home offices around the world, people are making decisions about their financial futures. They're weighing risk against reward, security against opportunity, prudence against ambition. Some of them will make wise choices. Some will make foolish ones. Some will be lucky, others unlucky. But all of them will be participating in the same eternal human story that began in those Amsterdam taverns 4 centuries ago. They may not realize it. They may think they're engaged in something entirely modern and sophisticated, but they're actually part of an ancient pattern, as old as commerce itself and as enduring as human nature. And perhaps there's some comfort in that continuity, in knowing that the hopes and fears and dreams that drive people to invest, to speculate, to take financial risks in pursuit of a better life. These are not modern afflictions, but timeless human experiences. The sailors who mortgaged their futures for tulip bulbs were not so different from the software engineers who day trade cryptocurrency during their lunch breaks. The British nobles who converted their estates into South Sea shares were driven by the same impulses as the suburban families who refinanced their homes during the housing boom. The details change, but the human heart remains constant. As night settles over the financial centers of the world, as the last trades are executed and the final positions closed, there's a moment of quiet that connects us to all those who came before. The Dutch merchants counting their tulip contracts by candlelight, the British investors gathering in coffee houses to discuss their South Sea holdings, the American families listening to stock prices on their radio sets in 1929. All of them were driven by the same fundamental hopes, the desire for security, for prosperity, for a better life for their children. All of them were navigating the same treacherous waters between opportunity and risk. Some found what they were looking for. Many did not. But all of them were part of the grand human experiment of trying to build wealth, trying to create value, trying to turn today's sacrifice into tomorrow's reward. It's an experiment that continues today, in forms they could never have imagined, but with motivations they would instantly recognize. And in that continuity, in that connection across the centuries, there's something both humbling and inspiring. Humbling because it reminds us how little human nature has changed despite all our technological progress. Inspiring because it reminds us how resilient human hope can be despite all the crashes and bubbles and disappointments of history. The markets will open again tomorrow. New opportunities will emerge. New technologies will promise to transform the world. New investors will make their first trades, convinced that they understand something their predecessors did not. And the ancient cycle will continue. Hope giving way to enthusiasm, enthusiasm to mania, mania to panic, and panic to the quiet wisdom that comes only after the storm has passed. But in that quiet, in those moments between one cycle and the next, there's space for reflection. Space to remember that behind every stock price and bond yield and cryptocurrency chart, there are human beings trying to build better lives. That the numbers on the screen represent not just money but dreams, hopes for retirement, for children's education, for the security that allows people to sleep peacefully at night. And that understanding, that recognition of the human heart beating beneath the mathematical surface of markets, might be the most important lesson of all. The tulips still bloom each spring in Holland, just as they did 4 centuries ago. Simple and beautiful and temporary, they offer their brief gift to the world before fading back into the earth. They serve no great economic purpose now. They're not traded as commodities or treated as investments. They're simply what they were always meant to be, flowers that bring beauty to gardens and joy to the people who tend them. In their quiet persistence, in their annual return to grace the Dutch countryside with colour and fragrance, there's a kind of wisdom that transcends all the financial theories and market analyses and investment strategies that have been developed in their wake. They remind us that some things have value that cannot be measured in prices or expressed in numbers. That beauty exists for its own sake, that the natural world continues its ancient rhythms regardless of human ambition or folly. And perhaps, in the end, that's enough. The markets will rise and fall. Fortunes will be made and lost. New bubbles will form and burst, carrying with them the hopes and dreams of new generations of investors. But the tulips will bloom each spring, indifferent to the chaos they once caused, offering their simple gift of beauty to anyone wise enough to appreciate it. And in that annual reminder, in that gentle return of colour to the world after winter's long darkness, we can find a kind of peace. The peace that comes from remembering what truly matters. The peace that comes from understanding that while markets may be eternally restless, some things endure. Beauty endures, love endures. The quiet satisfaction of work well done and leaves well lived endures. And perhaps, just perhaps, that's the most valuable lesson these ancient bubbles have to teach us. Sleep well. The markets can wait until morning. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world holds its breath between night and day, there's a moment of perfect stillness that traders have known for centuries. It's the pause before markets open, before the first prices flash across screens, before the day's hopes and fears begin their eternal dance. In that stillness, if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the echoes of all those who came before. The whispered negotiations in Amsterdam taverns, the excited chatter in London coffee houses, the urgent voices on trading floors that no longer exist. They all shared this moment, this breath of anticipation before the day's fortunes would be decided. And in sharing it, they become part of a tradition that stretches back through time like links in an unbroken chain. The stories we've traced, from tulips to South Sea stock to railways to the great crash of 1929, they might seem like ancient history now, quaint tales from simpler times when people were more naive about how markets really work. But stand in any modern trading room at the opening bell, and you'll see the same emotions playing across faces illuminated by computer screens. The same mixture of hope and fear. The same careful calculation of risk and reward. The same fundamental human drama of people trying to build better lives in an uncertain world. The technology has evolved beyond anything those early speculators could have imagined. Algorithms make thousands of trades per second. Information travels around the globe in milliseconds. Markets that were once separated by oceans now move in perfect synchronization. Yet the heart of the matter remains unchanged. Behind every algorithm is a human programmer. Behind every trade is a human decision. Behind every price movement is the collective expression of human hope and fear. We are not so different from our ancestors, despite all our technological sophistication. Consider the cryptocurrency mania that swept the world in recent years. The patterns were achingly familiar to anyone who knew the old stories. Unknown digital currencies with mysterious names rose from obscurity to dizzying heights, seemingly overnight. Young investors mortgaged their futures to buy digital tokens they didn't fully understand. Stories spread of college students who became millionaires, of early adopters who retired on their gains. The phrase "to the moon" became a rallying cry, as if gravity itself could be defeated by collective belief. The technology was genuinely revolutionary, just as tulips had been genuinely beautiful, just as railways had genuinely transformed transportation. Blockchain and distributed ledgers promised to reshape finance in ways that traditional institutions couldn't ignore. But the human response to that technology, the wild swings between euphoria and despair, the tendency to confuse innovation with guaranteed profit, these were as old as commerce itself. When the inevitable correction came, when prices fell as quickly as they had risen, the same painful lessons were learned again by a new generation. That prices can go down as well as up, that crowds can be wrong, that revolutionary technology doesn't automatically translate into investment returns. The aftermath brought the familiar cycle of recrimination and regulation. Experts who had been cheerleaders during the boom became prophets of doom during the bust. Governments scrambled to create new rules for assets that didn't fit into traditional categories. And gradually, as the dust settled and the true believers were separated from the speculators, something valuable began to emerge from the wreckage. Real applications for blockchain technology, genuine innovation in digital finance, the seeds of future progress planted in the ruins of speculation. This pattern of speculation followed by crash, followed by genuine progress, has repeated so often it seems almost intentional, as if the universe has designed markets to work this way, using human emotions as a kind of evolutionary force to drive innovation forward. Most of the companies formed during speculative manias fail. Most of the investments made during bubbles lose money. But the few that survive, the ones that have real value beneath the hype, they become the foundation for the next phase of economic development. The Dutch tulip trade, for all its excesses, helped establish Amsterdam as a centre of international commerce. The failed canal and railway companies of the 1800s left behind infrastructure that served their nations for generations. The dot-com companies that went bankrupt in 2000 had developed technologies that eventually powered the internet economy. It's an expensive way to allocate resources, wasteful and painful for those caught up in the speculation. But perhaps it's also the only way that genuinely transformative innovations can get the massive investment they need to develop. Conservative investors, by definition, don't fund revolutionary ideas. Banks don't lend money for technologies that don't yet exist. Venture capital follows patterns and invests in variations on proven concepts. But speculative manias, they throw money at anything that captures the collective imagination. Most of it is wasted, but some of it funds breakthroughs that might never have happened otherwise. The waste is real, the human cost is genuine, but perhaps it's the price we pay for progress. There's something both tragic and beautiful about the regularity of these cycles. Tragic because each generation seems condemned to repeat the mistakes of its predecessors. Beautiful because each repetition is also an expression of enduring human optimism. Despite all the crashes and bubbles and financial disasters of history, people continue to believe in the possibility of a better tomorrow. They continue to invest, to speculate, to risk their savings on ventures that might make them wealthy. This faith in the future, this willingness to trade presents security for uncertain but potentially greater rewards. It's what drives all economic progress. Without it, no one would start businesses, develop new technologies, or invest in anything more ambitious than government bonds. The challenge is distinguishing between healthy optimism and dangerous delusion, between investments based on genuine value and speculation based on nothing more than crowd psychology. It's a challenge that each generation faces anew, and one that becomes more difficult as markets become more complex and interconnected. The globalization of finance means that bubbles can spread faster and farther than ever before. A housing crisis in America can trigger bank failures in Europe. A currency collapse in Asia can crash commodity markets in South America. The Dutch tulip speculators of 1637 were at least trading in something they could see and touch. Modern investors buy and sell derivatives of derivatives, complex financial instruments that even their creators don't fully understand. The distance between the real economy and the financial economy has grown so vast that sometimes they seem to occupy entirely different universes. Yet, for all this complexity, the fundamental dynamics remain surprisingly simple. Prices rise when more people want to buy than want to sell. They fall when the reverse is true. And the decisions to buy or sell, those are still made by human beings with human emotions. Fear and greed, hope and despair, the desire to be part of something successful, and the terror of being left behind. These primal emotions drive markets just as powerfully today as they did 3 centuries ago. Perhaps that's why the old stories still resonate, why we can read about Dutch merchants trading their homes for tulip bulbs and recognize ourselves in their choices. The surface details change, but the underlying human drama remains constant. We are all, in our own ways, trying to navigate the same treacherous waters, trying to build security for ourselves and our families, trying to distinguish between genuine opportunities and mere speculation, trying to balance prudence with ambition, caution with courage. The markets provide a stage for this drama, but the real story is always about people, about their hopes and fears and dreams, about their capacity for both wisdom and folly, about their eternal struggle to create something better than what they inherited. In the grand sweep of history, individual fortunes seem almost insignificant. The merchants who lost everything in the Tulip Mania, the nobles who were ruined by South Sea stock, the investors who were wiped out in 1929. Their personal tragedies fade into statistical abstractions over time. But each loss was a real human story. A family forced from their home, children whose educations were cut short, dreams deferred or destroyed entirely. These individual costs are easy to forget when we focus on the larger patterns and cycles. When we talk about markets correcting themselves or bubbles serving useful evolutionary functions, we can lose sight of the human beings who pay the price for these grand historical processes. They deserve to be remembered, not just as statistics or cautionary tales, but as people who were trying to do their best with the information and opportunities available to them. The Dutch merchant who traded his house for tulip bulbs wasn't necessarily greedy or foolish. He may have been trying to secure his family's future in the only way that seemed possible at the time. The British investor who put his life savings into South Sea stock may have been following the advice of the most respected authorities of his era. They made their decisions based on the same kind of incomplete information and social pressure that influences investment decisions today. The fact that history judges their choices as mistakes doesn't make them less human or their suffering less real. In remembering them, in trying to understand their choices rather than simply condemning their errors. We honor both their humanity and our own. The modern investment world has developed sophisticated tools to help people make better financial decisions. Risk assessment models, diversification strategies, professional portfolio management, regulatory oversight, all designed to protect investors from the kind of speculative excess that characterized earlier eras. These tools are genuinely helpful. They can reduce risk, improve returns, and provide some protection against the worst kinds of financial predators. But they cannot eliminate the fundamental human tendency toward optimism and crowd-following behavior. If anything, the proliferation of investment options may have made the challenge more difficult. The average investor today faces choices that would have bewildered the most sophisticated financiers of previous centuries. Stocks, bonds, mutual funds, exchange-traded funds, options, futures, commodities, currencies, real estate investment trusts, hedge funds, private equity. Each category contains hundreds or thousands of specific investment options. The amount of information available is overwhelming. The complexity of interactions between different asset classes is beyond any individual's ability to fully comprehend. In such an environment, it's natural for people to fall back on simple heuristics, to follow the crowd, to invest in whatever seems to be working for others, to trust in experts who claim to have special knowledge or insight. But these shortcuts, these mental habits that help people navigate complexity, are precisely the mechanisms that create bubbles and manias. The same psychological tools that make modern life manageable also make us vulnerable to the same ancient patterns of speculation and crowd behavior. We have not evolved beyond our ancestors. We have simply created new contexts for the expression of timeless human nature. Perhaps the most important lesson from these historical bubbles is not about markets or economics or finance. Perhaps it's about humility. Humility about our ability to predict the future, about our capacity to remain rational when surrounded by irrational exuberance, about our tendency to believe that we are different, smarter, more informed than those who came before us. Isaac Newton's confession. I can calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people, stands as perhaps the most honest statement ever made about markets and human behavior. If someone of Newton's intellectual caliber could be caught up in speculative mania, what hope do the rest of us have? What makes us think that our superior technology, or better information, or more sophisticated analysis will protect us from making similar mistakes? The answer, uncomfortable as it may be, is that nothing can fully protect us. We are human beings, subject to human emotions and human limitations. We will continue to make mistakes, individually and collectively, because that is part of what makes us human. But perhaps there's wisdom in accepting this limitation, in recognizing that we are part of patterns larger than ourselves, in understanding that the markets we participate in are not just financial mechanisms, but expressions of human hopes and fears on a massive scale. This recognition doesn't make us passive victims of historical forces. We can still make thoughtful decisions, manage risks intelligently, and learn from both our own mistakes and those of others. But it does suggest that we should approach these decisions with appropriate humility and respect for the complexity of the systems we're engaging with. The stories of Tulips and South Sea stock and railway mania are not just entertainment or historical curiosities. They are mirrors that reflect back our own nature and limitations. They remind us that we are connected to all those who came before us by bonds stronger than technology or time. We share the same fundamental hopes for security, for prosperity, for meaning. We face the same fundamental challenges, distinguishing between value and hype, balancing risk and reward, maintaining perspective when surrounded by collective madness. The contexts change, but the essential human drama remains constant. And in that continuity, there's both comfort and responsibility. Comfort because it reminds us that we are part of something larger than ourselves, part of an ongoing human story that stretches back through the centuries and will continue long after we're gone. Responsibility because it reminds us that our choices matter, not just for ourselves, but for those who will follow in our footsteps. The precedents we set, the institutions we build, the lessons we learn and pass on, these become part of the legacy we leave for future generations. Each generation has the opportunity to learn from the mistakes of its predecessors and to build something better, not perfect. Human institutions are never perfect, but better, more stable, more equitable, more resistant to the worst kinds of speculative excess. Progress is possible, even if it's not guaranteed. Each crash has led to new regulations, new institutions, new ways of thinking about risk and responsibility. The financial system today, for all its flaws, is more stable and transparent than it was a century ago. But vigilance is required. Each new generation must learn these lessons for itself, must develop its own defenses against the eternal temptations of greed and speculation. As dawn breaks over the financial centers of the world, as computer screens flicker to life and the day's trading begins, there's a moment when the past and present seem to converge. The same sun that rose over Amsterdam during the Tulip Mania, that warmed the coffee houses of London during the South Sea bubble, that witnessed the railway boom and the crash of '29, that same sun illuminates the screens where today's fortunes will be made and lost. The technologies have changed beyond recognition, but the fundamental human drama continues. Somewhere, at this very moment, an investor is making a decision that will change their life forever. Someone is buying their first stock, full of hope for the future. Someone else is watching their life savings evaporate in a market crash. These individual moments of triumph and tragedy are being repeated thousands of times across the globe, each one a small thread in the vast tapestry of human commerce and ambition. Most of these stories will never be remembered. The vast majority of investors will live and trade and succeed or fail in comfortable anonymity. Their hopes and fears and dreams will be known only to themselves and their families. But collectively, their actions create the markets that shape our world. Their decisions, aggregated across millions of participants, become the forces that allocate capital, fund innovation, and drive economic progress. In this sense, every investor, from the most sophisticated hedge fund manager to the most naive day trader, is participating in something much larger than themselves. They are all part of the great human experiment of trying to create wealth, trying to build a better future, trying to transform individual savings into collective prosperity. It's an experiment that has been running for centuries and will continue for centuries more. It has produced both spectacular successes and devastating failures. It has created wealth beyond the dreams of previous generations and destroyed fortunes that seemed unassailable. But through it all, it has also been the engine of human progress, the mechanism by which societies have funded exploration, invention, and innovation. The system that has allowed ideas to become businesses, businesses to become industries, and industries to transform the world. The tulip fields of Holland still bloom each spring, their colours as vivid as they were 4 centuries ago. but they bloom now in a world that would be unrecognizable to those early speculators. The roads they travel were built by railway companies that rose and fell in speculative manias. The cars they drive were made possible by industrial innovations funded by stock markets. The phones in their pockets connect them to global networks that grew out of the dot-com boom and bust. Each bubble and crash has left its mark on the physical landscape of human civilization. The infrastructure remains long after the speculation has been forgotten. The technologies survive, even when the companies that developed them do not. In this sense, perhaps the speculators and bubble chasers of history deserve more credit than they typically receive. Yes, they were often driven by greed rather than vision. Yes, their manias caused real suffering and economic disruption. But they were also, in their own chaotic way, funding the future. They were providing the capital that allowed inventors and entrepreneurs to pursue ideas that more conservative investors would never have supported. The waste was enormous, but the achievements were real. And perhaps that's the best we can hope for from any human institution. That it produces more value than it destroys. That it moves us forward, even if the path is inefficient and sometimes painful. Markets, for all their flaws and failures, have proven remarkably effective at this basic task. They have channeled human ambition and self-interest into engines of collective progress. Not perfect engines, not always fair or equitable engines, but engines nonetheless. Mechanisms for transforming individual dreams into shared reality. As night falls once again over the world's trading floors, as the day's positions are closed and the accounts are settled, there's a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the great wheel continues to turn. Tomorrow will bring new opportunities and new challenges. New companies will be born, new technologies will be developed, new fortunes will be made and lost. The eternal human drama of commerce and ambition will continue to play out on stages, both grand and intimate. Some of tomorrow's investors will be wise and patient. Others will be foolish and impulsive. Most will be somewhere in between. Ordinary people trying to make the best decisions they can with incomplete information and uncertain futures. They will all be participating in the same ancient tradition that began in those Amsterdam taverns so long ago. The tradition of trying to turn today's sacrifice into tomorrow's reward. Of betting on the future. Of believing that human ingenuity and ambition can create something better than what exists today. It's a noble tradition, despite all its failures and excesses. It reflects the best of human nature, our capacity for hope, our willingness to take risks for the sake of progress, our faith in the possibility of improvement. But it also reflects our limitations, our tendency to confuse price with value, our susceptibility to crowd behavior, our difficulty in distinguishing between genuine opportunity and mere speculation. These limitations are not flaws to be eliminated, but aspects of human nature to be acknowledged and managed. They are part of what makes markets human institutions rather than mathematical abstractions. And perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps it's fitting that the systems we use to allocate resources and fund the future should reflect both our strengths and our weaknesses, our wisdom and our folly. After all, markets are not ends in themselves, but means to human ends. They exist to serve human purposes, to help people build the lives they want to live, to fund the projects and dreams that make civilization possible. In serving those purposes, they inevitably reflect all the complexity and contradiction of human nature. The greed and the generosity, the wisdom and the folly, the magnificent achievements and the spectacular failures that define the human condition. The last traders have gone home for the evening. The screens have gone dark. The numbers that seemed so urgent just hours ago have faded into historical footnotes. But somewhere in the darkness, new dreams are taking shape. Young entrepreneurs are sketching business plans on napkins. Inventors are tinkering with prototypes in garage workshops. Investors are studying annual reports by lamplight, looking for the next great opportunity. The cycle continues, as it has for centuries, and as it will for centuries to come. Each generation rediscovering the same fundamental truths, making the same essential mistakes, achieving the same kinds of breakthroughs, and suffering the same kinds of setbacks. There's something both humbling and inspiring about this continuity. Humbling because it reminds us how little we've really changed, despite all our technological progress. Inspiring because it reminds us that we are part of something much larger than ourselves. We are temporary custodians of traditions that stretch back through the centuries. We hold them for a brief moment and then pass them on to the next generation, hopefully in slightly better condition than we found them. The markets will open again tomorrow, as they have every business day for centuries. New prices will be set, new fortunes will be made and lost, new dreams will be born and destroyed. And in all of that activity, in all that buying and selling and hoping and fearing, the great human story will continue to unfold. Not the story of markets or economics or finance, but the deeper story of human beings trying to build better lives in an uncertain world. That's the story that connects the Dutch tulip traders to the British railway investors, to the American stock speculators of the 20s, to the cryptocurrency enthusiasts of today. It's the story that gives meaning to all the numbers and charts and technical analysis that fill the financial pages. Behind every data point is a human decision. Behind every price movement is a human hope or fear. And in that recognition, in that understanding of the human heart that beats beneath the mathematical surface of markets, we find our connection to all those who came before us and all those who will come after. The tulips bloom and fade, the seasons turn, the markets rise and fall. But the story continues. And perhaps, in the end, that's enough. Sleep well, knowing that you are part of this ancient and ongoing story, that your hopes and dreams and fears connect you to countless others who have walked this path before you. The markets can wait until morning. There will always be another day to begin again.